Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News Weekend. I'm Dennis Ward. National Day of Truth and Reconciliation events happened all week across the country. We caught up with First Nations Family Caring Society's Cindy Blackstock to find out what the day means to her.
Cindy, tell us, what does the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation mean to you?
Well, for all of us this year, we're actually celebrating the theme of resistance. The resistance offered by First Nations, Métis and Inuit people to colonization, and also the resistance are actors in the settler community, like Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, the Chief Medical Health Officer. So that's a theme we're going to be showing Canadians.
How would you like to see it evolve over the years?
I really want to see it to be really one about justice, about what we need to learn from the past so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. With Dr. Bryce, he raised the alarm about the preventable causes of death of kids in residential schools in 1907. The Canadian government stonewalled him. The public were outraged, but when the headlines died, the kids did too. We now have murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We still have the federal government dragging its feet on First Nations kids. We could be learning from history and not turning the page on those headlines and holding governments to account.
What's your plan for the day?
We are actually going to be unveiling a plaque at 10:30 on Spark Street in front of James Hope and Son, where Dr. Bryce would have walked in with his manuscript of national crime 100 years ago. And then we'll be conducting tours along with the Assembly of Seven Generations Youth Group of the downtown core, really showing all the places where these key people in residential schools worked and the decisions that were made. And then at Beechwood Cemetery, where Dr. Bryce and Duncan Campbell Scott are buried, we'll be doing more historical tours over there. Again, really encouraging Canadians to learn from the past so that they can actually do the right thing today.
Okay, great. Thank you.
APTN marked the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation with a live event from Ottawa, as well as special programming all day Friday. Here's a look at the performance of Mother by singer-songwriter Beatrice Deer.
Beatrice Deer's song, Mother, speaks to the heartbreak so many women suffered when their babies were stolen to the schools.
Lorsque je referme les yeux, lorsque les cris en moi résonnent, lorsqu'ils deviennent sauvages, c'est route-t-il à douter. Tu es mon feu, ma source de lumière. Je porte en moi ce rêve millénaire. Cet héritage aux mille échos de rire. Au-delà de mes autres à travers ton regard, j'ai vu tes os cassés et ta force de continuer. Tu es mon feu, ma
It was a powerful event and day. You can watch the entire event at aptnnews.ca/ndtr. Coming up after the break, we'll introduce you to a couple who met in residential school and are still going strong 40 years later. Stay with us. Welcome back to APTN National News Weekend. A Manitoba couple who met in residential school have now been together for 40 years. While they didn't experience the hardships many faced while in residential school, they did have to grow up outside of their home communities, and that had an impact on them. Tamara Pimentel has their story.
This went on our jackets, right?
For Jennifer and Darcy Wood, their time at the Portage La Prairie Residential School in the early 70s led to friendships and experiences that pushed them out of their comfort zones.
I was involved with the sports in the school as well. As part of the basketball team, even the football.
We made a lot of friends there. And that's where I met Darcy.
Little did they know their friendship would last a lifetime. Jennifer and Darcy married in 1992. The pair were both raised by residential school survivors. They didn't experience abuse during their time in the institution. They even went home for Christmas. But the couple says they now feel disconnected from their communities. Darcy is from Garden Hill in northern Manitoba.
Growing up, I remember a lot of times I was in the bush, and I loved that life. I missed it. But that was during the fur trade type of thing. That's how we survived. That way of life I stopped. That's when I was 7 because I had to go to school. My dad said, "You can't. The world is changing. You got to go to school."
I came to residential school from northern Manitoba, from Oxford House. My father brought me there. The school, they felt, was inadequate in Oxford House. So when we got to the school, I brought in my suitcases, and Dad was with me, and he told me, I guess I'll see you. And I didn't know he was going to leave.
Jennifer says leaving her father meant leaving his teachings on the land.
He was a very skilled hunter and fisherman, and as well he spoke the language fluently. And just being in an environment with a family, you're disconnected, and when you go back to the community, a lot of people will treat you different because you left the reserve and the community, and a lot of people think that you're either acting different or looking different and dressing different. So you always felt a slight disconnect in that way.
Jennifer and Darcy have broken a cycle many face due to intergenerational trauma. They have 11 grandchildren, enough to create their own sports team. Darcy runs 2 nonprofit organizations bringing renewable energy and healthy food to communities in northern Manitoba. And Jennifer works for the National Centre of Truth and Reconciliation, bringing a voice to survivors.
We were fortunate in our time at residential school that we didn't experience getting abused, because a lot of the survivors across Canada fell to being abused, like significantly. That is why a lot of our people are on the streets and are homeless, because they fell to the addictions and dealing with their pain. We don't have the resources in Canada to accommodate that need, and I believe that going forward, I hope that the government will step up and start recognizing what the survivors need and start putting some resources and funding towards that.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Shirley Williams has been a lifelong advocate for Ojibwe language and culture. Her passion to be a better teacher than the one she had at residential school drove her to develop better resources and curriculum for her students. Here's Annette Francis with that story.
For close to 40 years, Shirley Williams has walked the hallways of Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, as a student, a professor, and a professor emeritus.
So I come in, I go and teach maybe a lecture in 100 or other courses, or a PhD introduction. I usually come and lecture and things like that.
Williams has dedicated her life to teaching the Anishinaabe-Moan language and Anishinaabe culture. She says her father was a huge influence.
He said, I want one of my children to speak the language and culture. All the other children that we have are coming back and they don't want to speak the language or they don't want to continue to learn about the culture. But I want one of our daughters to learn the language and culture. And I sort of understood that it meant me because I was the last one to be at home.
Although Williams went to residential school, she retained her language, something her father had prepared her for after convincing the Indian agent to keep his youngest daughter home until she was 10.
During those 3 years that I stayed home, from 7 till 10 years old, they made sure I was with my father or I was with my mother. They're all speaking in the language and they were always teaching me about medicines or birch bark or whatever we were doing. In
1949, at the age of 10, she was sent 150 kilometers away from Wikamkong to St. Joseph Residential School in Spanish, Ontario. She remembers arriving.
First one asked, "What's your name?" Now, I was trained to ask, to listen to what is your name. So I understood her, what she was asking me. So I was so proud to say my name is Shirley Pheasant. And then the next girl, she looked it up and checked it off. And then she went to the other girl and she went over there and then she checked my name, I guess, off. And then she says, "You're now number 19.
In her 6th year, she was strapped and punished without food and water for 4 days. She'd had enough and left at the age of 16 with a grade 8 education.
When you're 16, you can get out. So we used to say, I'd rather be dumb than to endure all of the things that we're enduring here.
Williams continued her education and eventually made it to Trent University for Native Studies. She remembers a cultural workshop during that time.
I don't know how that elder knew, he asked, "What is it that you always wanted to be?" And that really stuck in my mind, And on the 4th day, he went back again. He says, "You, grandmother, you said you wanted to be a nurse?" I thought, "Yes, I told you that." And then he says, "Your job is to nurture the minds of your people."
About 3 years after graduating, she was back to Trent.
Fred Wheatley, who was the elder for this university, was teaching the language, and he was retiring. And so they were looking for somebody who had the knowledge of language and culture. And I was encouraged to apply. I thought, well, probably never get it anyway, but I tried. And wouldn't you know, I got the job because my language. And I thought, when I got the language position, I thought, now then, I might know the language, but how do I teach it?
So she enrolled at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay to learn how to teach. After a language conference, she overheard some people talking. Then it came to her what that elder had meant.
She said, "This is what's happening with the language. It restores your being." And she was trying to explain that to the other ladies. And then I thought, oh, that's funny. I'm finding out what that meant. Your job is to nurture the minds of your people. The language restores your mentality. That is where your home is.
That's when she began to create learning resources based on what the students said they wanted.
From there, I developed a curriculum, what they said, which is the Introduction to Anishinaabe Women. And I wrote on it. It's been used now right across Canada.
It's been 18 years since Williams' retirement, but that doesn't mean she's taking it easy. She's still creating resources and teaching. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Peterborough.
Great stuff. Coming up after the break, what truth and reconciliation means to the youth. Stay with us. Welcome back. The first Mi'kmaq person to enter the Catholic order and become a nun is also a residential school survivor. Angel Moore brings us this story of Sister Dorothy Moore.
Sister Dorothy Moore says people always ask, how could you become a nun?
How could you ever think of becoming one of those people that punished you so much? That one of those people whose intent was to change you from.
Moore, 89 years old, of the Member 2 First Nation, was taken to the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School when she was 10 years old and punished on the first day of class for not understanding English.
It wasn't my language, and yet I was expected to understand. I was expected to understand what I was being told. And because I didn't understand what I was being told, I was being punished.
It was the only residential school in the Maritimes where about 1,000 Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik children were taken. Moore recalls the impact of that first day.
I was terrified. I was terrified. I was terrified of this teacher. And I just had no way of understanding what I can do to make a difference for me.
Moore says the children worked half days, laundry, cleaning, or cooking, but she was sent back to the classroom.
And I put the wrong number down, and I get a whack in the head with a pointer. And this continued for at least a good hour, if not more. I mean, in my memory, it just says it was an afternoon of punishment. So much so that I could no longer comb my hair.
Managed by the Archdiocese of Halifax, the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and staffed by the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, the school operated from 1930 to 1967. Moore says it was genocide.
It was very inhumane way of treating a child.
After the residential school, Moore attended the school in the Eskazoni First Nation, where the Sisters of St. Martha taught. Moore says the nuns behaved differently there.
These sisters were talking to us. These sisters were laughing with us. These sisters were walking with us. These sisters were encouraging us to do something for yourself.
Inspired, Moore decided to become a Sister of St. Martha.
I want to be one of those. I want to be one of those sisters. I want to be a sister to work with my own people, my own people.
Moore continued school, became a teacher, and reformed the Nova Scotia education system to include Indigenous culture and language, reviving what the residential school tried to destroy.
I was determined I was not going to be held hostage, that I was not going to be held hostage by them.
Moore is still teaching. She wrote a book called A Journey of Love and Hope to share her story with others. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Antigonish, Nova Scotia.
What is the meaning of truth and reconciliation? That's the question the Senate Committee of Indigenous Peoples put to Indigenous youth this past week. Here's Annette Francis with what some youth had to say.
26-year-old Jamie Maxey is one of 5 youth invited to a Senate committee to share their thoughts on what truth and reconciliation means to them. Maxey says he's honored to be chosen to speak today. He grew up in the child welfare system in Toronto. He told the committee he's critical of what reconciliation is and if it can even be achieved with the current statistics.
Overrepresentation in homelessness, incarceration rates, addiction, poverty, all those things, they all intertwine. So I really think child welfare reform is really needed in this country, because if kids are still being removed from their culture and their families, we're still doing the same thing we were in residential schooling, which is to kill the Indian in the Indian.
Taylor Bain Tizako is Dene from Fort Nelson and Prophet River First Nations in British Columbia. She says reconciliation is a buzzword that's lacking in tangible outcomes. While she's critical of it, she hopes it can be reached, but it's going to take something concrete.
I'm wearing my shirt that says land back. That's one thing that's sticking out is, like, I think I believe reconciliation is possible when my people are, when our land is returned to us, when I can speak my language, when my nieces and nephews can speak my language, when when this whole institution is all Indigenous, maybe that's when I'll believe that they're actually listening.
Gabrielle Fayon is co-founder of a youth-led organization called Assembly of Seven Generations. She got emotional when explaining how important her organization and others are to the Indigenous community and how they deserve continued funding.
Organizers face a cycle of poverty and insecurity due to the lack of consistent funding. They face displacement without spaces to organize and gather. And we face burnout.
The committee assured the youth their concerns were heard and action will be taken. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
To the west coast now, where a bridge on Vancouver Island was painted orange to honor survivors before the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Seychot First Nation says the bridge was a reminder of the Port Alberni residential school that stood nearby. And many members said they wouldn't go near the bridge because it reminded them of their former school. The bridge now also shows the words, "Every child matters." The First Nation says the project was done in collaboration with the province of BC and Main Road Contracting. Residential school survivors, elementary students, and volunteers came out to paint the pillars of the bridge orange. Chief Wamish says they listened to survivors who attended the residential school, and they wanted to make the bridge more welcoming while honoring their history.
I think it's just the beginning, to be honest. I think we'll have other recognition in the future in our territory and along the highway specifically, because 1 to 1.5 million people a year drive through our community on their way to Tofino or Euclid on the west coast. And we need to make sure they know. We need to make sure nobody ever forgets what happened here. But again, that to show our resiliency that, yes, we are still here today.
Well, that is all the time we have for your APTN National News for this weekend. For much more, including all of our coverage of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.